and I'm really honored to be with you as the first of your keynote speakers in this series. So thank you very, very much. I do have to apologize to everyone who's joined the call. It is, after all, Friday afternoon when we should be out enjoying good times. But, you know, there's lots to worry about in the world these days. And as if that wasn't enough, now you have to listen to an economist for an hour on a Friday afternoon yet. You know, with the economics is known as the dismal science, and that reputation is especially deserved these days. I sometimes feel like the Grim Reaper coming to these webinars to talk about what lies ahead for our economy and for the labor market and for people working hard to try and survive. But at any rate, thank you very much for joining us and having this. I should also give you another heads up. They also say an economist is someone who's good with numbers but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So that's just my fair warning. Friday afternoon, if you happen to have a beer beside you, I've got no offense at all if you start drinking partway through my presentation. I might start doing that myself. I'm going to share some slides here to go through my presentation with. Ron, can you give me the thumbs up that you see the title slide there? Is that coming through okay? Just verbal, or excellent. Okay, we're in business. There we go. The pandemic and work, what's coming next, and how to change work for good. There's the website for the Center for Future Work at the bottom. I encourage you to check that out. I will be speaking from one of our research papers, and I've sent the link around in the chat. If people want to download the paper, please do. There's my Twitter handle and the Center's Twitter handle. You're welcome to join the conversation, including tweeting from this presentation, if you'd like. So what a moment this is. Incredible, of course, with this the pandemic and then the economic and social fallout of the pandemic. The health impacts and risks, of course, are bad enough, but then what happens when the whole economy starts to shut down? Starting back in March, of course, when health officials ordered the closure of those parts of the economy where the risk of contagion was the hardest or the highest. Where the face-to-face or hands-on connection between generally workers and consumers was the riskiest, those parts of the economy had to be shut down, and they were. And a good thing too, because the situation would be far, far worse if we hadn't. I completely reject the idea that there's some kind of a trade-off between protecting public health and protecting the economy. That's absolute nonsense. Misinformation spread by people who just want to make money, no matter what the human consequences of it are. Clearly, and economists around the world are near unanimous on this, the best thing to do for the economy is to defeat this virus, and that means taking extraordinary measures to prevent contagion. Now, of course, those initial sectors were shut down, like retail and hospitality, personal services, entertainment and arts, some transportation services, but it didn't stop there. There's a thing in the economy called input-output linkages. All of those industries buy stuff from other industries. So if a retail shop closes, they stop placing wholesale orders, which in turn stop placing orders with manufacturing. And the impact is felt throughout the supply chain, all the more so given the international disruptions that have occurred. Now I think we're seeing, in a way, a deeper and more damaging set of chain reactions through the expenditure and income mechanisms that normally make the economy go around. Consumer spending, of course, has been dramatically undermined. Business investment, even more so. Our exports also shocked. And what initially started out as a restriction on the supply of the economy in those initial sectors of consumer-facing services has now morphed and spread into what is a deep, widespread, and lasting demand-side recession. And it's going to take us years to rebuild the amount of work that we're doing in the economy. But my point here that I'll stress, we also have to pay attention to rebuilding the quality of work, because there's ways in which longstanding weaknesses in how we organized and protected work in the economy contributed to the negative effects of the pandemic. Just a quick summary. This is, again, when you might want to crack open that beer and start drinking. These are very, very frightening numbers. 3 million jobs in Canada lost in 2 months between February and April. Now, about 2/3 of those have come back in the months up till August, as we saw the reopening, the partial reopening anyway, of some of those initial hard-hit sectors. GDP fell by 18% between February and April. And again, we've never seen a downturn that fast and that deep in our entire economic history. But again, with the partial reopening that we've seen, we've won back about half of that decline by June, which is the most recent GDP data that we have. You had people losing incomes, people losing jobs, businesses losing cash flow. Everyone had to stop spending as a result, and that's where the impact spread into this demand side recession rather than just a temporary and limited supply closure. The key task we face now, this is a terrible situation. How do we climb out of it? And if we allow those deep demand side mechanisms to continue to hold back our work and our production and our income generation, then we will be in a multi-year depression rather than just a short-term catastrophe. They say that misery loves company. Well, we've got good company here. This is the OECD's overview of what's happening, what they expect to happen to GDP, peak to trough, in all of their member countries. And there's Canada, kind of in the middle. Not much to choose between us and other countries. Mostly the differences between countries depend on how much GDP was produced in those initial shutdown sectors. But the reality is this is a global problem, and ultimately, we're in the same boat as those other countries. One important thing is to point out that the impact on labor markets and jobs is even worse than the official statistics would tend to suggest. So the latest data shows unemployment rate in Canada, an official unemployment rate for August of just over 10%. But that really is just the tip of the iceberg, as they say. That does not remotely capture the amount of underutilization that's being experienced. There's a lot of people who Statistics Canada counts as being employed. That is, they're on the payroll. They have an ongoing relationship with the employer, perhaps because of the impact of the wage subsidy that the federal government is paying, but they didn't work a single hour. There's lots of others, hundreds of thousands of others who lost work but are not actively seeking it. Remember, for Statistics Canada purposes, if you're going to be called officially unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work, putting in several applications a week. And that is not something that really makes a lot of sense, particularly with health restrictions and the absence of jobs. And then there's a lot of people who've just lost most of their work, but still work a handful of hours and then again show up as officially employed. If we put all those together, what I would call a more realistic measure of unemployment in the economy is still above 20%. So really, this is a depression level situation that we're in, despite the partial recovery that we've seen between April and August. There's been a lot of debate around between economists about the shape of the likely recovery from this downturn. Of course, we find a simple way to have this debate in terms of letters. Optimists say there should be a quick snapback in the economy once the health restrictions are lifted. That looks like a V. Others are confident the snapback will occur, but it will just take a little longer. That's the U. Some don't expect a snapback at all and expect us to be stuck at the lower level of output for an extended period of time, the L. Others have pointed out that there's different paths for recovery for different groups in the economy. The Amazons and Zooms and a few other big corporations, even the grocery stores, have profited mightily from the pandemic. So they're bouncing back nicely. But then there's other groups of people that are being left out of the recovery entirely, and that's the thinking of the K. Here's my view. I expect that we will see a partial rebound. In fact, we already have, but it's not going to get us back to where we were and where we need to be unless there's a very aggressive and sustained effort, an ambitious reconstruction plan, basically led by government, to lead the economy back towards a normal, full capacity type of situation. If I were to draw the shape of the curve, it would look something like this. The initial dramatic downturn, a partial rebound, perhaps halfway, as we've seen so far, but then a bouncing along the bottom, where we'll get, some signs of recovery, but we'll see other signs of downturn again, resulting from potentially the second wave of COVID that we're seeing now, potentially from businesses that just can't stay alive anymore after several months of this and throw in the towel. And other factors. So this kind of bouncing along at the part-way level, unless we have a very deliberate and well-resourced effort to get back to full capacity. The problem is, of course, this is not a letter, at least not a letter in the English alphabet that I'm familiar with. I've looked at this and tried to see, what shape it is. I've asked for help. Somebody says it looks like a sideways corkscrew. So if you turn your head slightly to the side, you can see the corkscrew there, although I don't know about that handle. I guess that's maybe kind of a, I don't know, Art Nouveau handle that somebody put on it. Somebody on Twitter suggested I think the best answer. They said it looks like the Loch Ness Monster recovery. Now look at this, folks. Here we've got the Loch Ness Monster's neck, and then it goes down, then it comes back up, and then it bounces along, just kind of like exactly that shape that I just drew. So this is my contribution to economic history. I expect to win the Nobel Prize for identifying and, with my colleagues, naming the Loch Ness Monster recovery. But I think this is what we're in for. What do we see coming next? Well, of course, if an economist says they can predict the future, all you know is that they're going to be wrong. In fact, another thing they say about economists is we're placed on planet Earth in order to make astrologers look good with our predictions. That being said, I do think that we're in for some tough times and that things are likely to get worse before they get better. We are well into a second wave of COVID, as we're seeing with these frightening numbers. Especially in Ontario, Quebec, BC, and Alberta. And the thing is now we're not getting the same aggressive and focused response to it that we did back in March, which means those numbers are clearly going to continue to grow. And there's lots of sort of hand-wringing and sort of vague moralizing about how young people shouldn't hang out with each other, et cetera, but that's not going to do the trick. So I'm very pessimistic about where those numbers are going. We aren't going to see a shutdown of the scale that we saw in March. I do think we're going to see restrictions tightened in some areas. We may see schools close again. We are clearly going to see a second order phenomenon of layoffs from employers who didn't shut down completely during the first shutdown, but who are now downsizing permanently because they don't expect their businesses to return. We've seen that in terms of major layoffs in some manufacturing companies, airlines, and others who could operate in terms of the health restrictions, but there's no demand for their products anymore. Also businesses, which tried to hang on for a few months, but now, especially as we head into winter and potentially another second wave, are just throwing in the towel. Lots of uncertainty coming from all over in the economy and internationally. I stay awake at night worrying about the economy. I stay awake even later at night worrying about Donald Trump and what's going to happen in America. And that will have enormous implications on business investment, exports, and our economy. There's no doubt about it. So I hate to start off the weekend with this bad news, but I do think this recession is going to get worse before it gets better. We could see another downturn, what's called a double dip in economics, to go along with the second wave of COVID. I argued that we won't get back to our sort of full potential unless we have a deliberate, massive, sustained, multi-year program of reconstruction to get us there. And government is the only force in society that has the authority, the ability to act on a national level, and the financial resources to make that happen. No individual companies can make a difference to that macroeconomic trajectory. The public sector has to lead it. And there's all kinds of areas of work and investment and service provision that the government could expand. The income supports that we've debated a lot are very important. We have to provide people with enough money to live and prevent them from losing their homes. But income support alone will not rebuild the economy. We absolutely have to have the government sector take on the traditional role that in a capitalist economy is provided by or conducted by the private business sector of marshaling resources, putting investment into motion, creating jobs, and stimulating production. In our economy, we traditionally rely on business to do most of that, but that economic leadership function is going to have to shift more to the public sector, because the private sector is too damaged, too shocked, and at this point too underfunded in order to lead the sort of recovery that we need. So infrastructure investments, rebuilding health system, including our long-term care system, which was the weak link in our overall social safety net, financing an ambitious climate transition, building non-market housing to address the housing crisis in our major cities, permanently expanding public services, not just as a stimulus measure, but as a long-term economic growth measure. The overarching goal is to put people back to work and get us back close to our potential. And there's I think, a powerful historical analogy for this. This is C.D. Howe announcing a major investment in aerospace industry. And C.D. Howe was appointed the Minister of Reconstruction. In 1944, the war wasn't even over yet, but the government recognized that if they didn't have a strong, sustained reconstruction plan, then all the soldiers coming home from the war were going to re-enter a situation, then we'd snap back to something like the Great Depression that persisted for 10 years until the war started. So there was a legitimate concern about how do we ensure that doesn't repeat itself. And the way it didn't was through a sustained reconstruction plan that involved public investment, industrial policy, commitment to full employment at the macroeconomic level, and an expansion of the social welfare system. And I think we need something like that today. I'm invoking the name of C.D. Howe. So that will be a surprise to the C.D. Howe Institute, which probably isn't aligned with my view on the reconstruction plan and the need for public leadership of it. But on the other hand, I think if we look at the, not holding out C.D. Howe as perfect or anything, but the expansive public-led vision of national construction that occurred after World War II, I think is a powerful analogy for what we face today. Of course, we're having already great big debates in Canada about how are we going to pay for all this stuff. And if we did have a reconstruction plan of the sort that I'm describing and advocating, we would need enormous public resources to flow. Some of it in the form of public investment. And when you're doing public investment, you're getting a capital asset in return for what you spend. And both the fiscal accounting of that and the politics of that are quite different than just running big deficits. All that being said, there's no doubt that public debt is going to grow enormously. We're going to have a federal deficit this year of something close to $400 billion, or close to 20% of GDP. This is astounding. And we are going to see the accumulated debt rise rapidly, federally and provincially, exceeding 100% of GDP within a couple of years, no doubt about that. This is not something to fear, to stay awake at night. This is actually something in a way to celebrate, because those large deficits are the flip side of the coin of the public investment we need to address the catastrophe that we're facing. And again, the analogy to World War II is very clear. We finished World War II with a public debt of 150% of GDP, and nobody cared. And nobody said, let's cut back and cut down and run surpluses to pay off the debt. In fact, we continued to run deficits most years after World War II as part of that reconstruction plan that I was describing. It is absolutely possible to have large public debt. In fact, the economics of it have changed dramatically because interest rates are near zero. They're negative in real terms. And you have the Bank of Canada now purchasing most of the federal debt that is being issued to pay for the crisis. And there's no reason why they can't. There's other countries around the world. Japan, for example, their public debt is 250% of GDP, and it doesn't hold them back one iota. So the old knee-jerk fears about debt and deficit and hitting the debt wall absolutely are not relevant. The only constraint on how we can rebuild is whether we've got people who can do the work, people who can use their brains and brawn and produce goods and services and help generate the incomes and the taxes to get our economy back to our full potential. And until we get to a point where we're running out of workers, and you know that we're nowhere near that, there should be no concern whatsoever about the government spending as much money as they're doing. I'd like to take the second part of my presentation and review some work that we've done through the Center for Future Work on how labor markets and labor policies and the conditions of work have to change for good after this pandemic. And as I mentioned, I sent around the link to the paper in the chat. When I say work must change for good, I'm meaning both senses of that word. It must change for the better, but it also must change permanently in the long run, because there's lots of ways in which the long-standing and well-known fault lines in our labor market really contributed to the catastrophe that we experienced during the pandemic. Things like precarious work and insecure work and the inequalities in our labor market, absolutely, we knew those were problems long before we ever heard of COVID-19, but they absolutely contributed in a really important way to the impact of the pandemic on work, on workers, and on our society. And as we rebuild, hopefully in the context of this ambitious long-term reconstruction plan. We've got to address some of those long-standing failures. So the paper goes through and identified 10 different ways in which we have to improve and address the quality of work as we're reconstructing the economy. And I invite you to see the whole list. I won't have time to go through them all. I'd like to touch on a few of them that I think are particularly relevant. I want to mention the issue of space and spatial configuration in workplaces and what that means after COVID. I want to talk about this huge phenomenon of working from home and what that means. We have to talk about precarious work and how it contributed to the spread of contagion. And then I want to talk about one that I think sort of draws all the others together, which is how do we empower workers with the ability to express their demands and win some of their demands in order to make sure that work is improved for the better. So let's go through those 4 out of the 10, a short list, if you like, a bit of an appetizer. And again, I invite you to see the full paper for all of them. The issue of space. Workplaces have been about the most dangerous place where you can catch COVID, particularly long-term care facilities, of course. That is a workplace and also a residence. You're there close to in close quarters, shoulder to shoulder with people that you work with. And the closer you are, the more likely you are to get the infection. And it turns out that being very close to your co-workers is correlated quite strongly with other conditions and levels of empowerment and income. People who don't have secure jobs and aren't paid very well are also the ones who are generally forced to work shoulder to shoulder with their colleagues and therefore face a greater risk of a contagion. And this pandemic is not a one-time event. I think one thing we know for certain is there's going to be other pandemics, and we're going to have to permanently prepare ourselves to be safer. And in a workplace, one of the ways to be safer, not the only way, is to give workers a bit more space, a bit more dignity, and a bit more safety that way. So we did some research that went through and showed the correlation between people who work in generally lower wage jobs and those whose proximity to other workers was higher. So you can actually parse the data according to a score, a quantitative score of proximity. How close are you to other people? And if you work closer to other people, in general, not universally, but in general, you're also paid less and you have less secure job, fewer benefits. On the other hand, the very powerful people in our labor market, think of the CEO. Well, the CEO has always got a corner office with lots of space and lots of privacy. Again, that's not universal. There are some high-income professionals, especially in medical care, who work in close contact with others. But by and large, if you're going to give people more space at work, you're going to be assisting lower-income people in staying healthier and having somewhat more dignified, more pleasant job than having to work shoulder to shoulder with people for 8 hours a day. How about this issue of working from home? There's been a huge increase in working from home during the pandemic. I do not think it's going to last. I think that the evidence is growing that for both employers and for workers, there's lots of drawbacks to working from home. So I think there'll be some increase in working from home on a long-term basis, but ultimately when it's safe, people are going to want to get back to regular workplaces. There are some benefits from the work from home phenomena. A large number of people were able to keep their incomes, keep working, and that helped them, it helped the economy. Working from home, again, like everything else about this pandemic, also distributed very, very unequally. So generally, people who could work from home, again, it's not universal, but generally, people were in managerial or professional jobs where they work on computers most of the time. They were making more money before the pandemic. And lo and behold, they're the ones who get to keep making money. And it's one of the reasons why high-income people have hardly experienced any economic damage from the pandemic at all in terms of lost work and lost incomes. There's lots of risks, though, from working from home, and I think we're going to have to address those in terms of our labor regulations and our employment practices and union strategies coming out of the pandemic. The number of Canadians working from home tripled as the pandemic hit and has stayed very high since then. Some of the issues to think about: what about the space at home? Most people don't have a spare room that they can just allocate to work. What about the costs of that space and other costs of working from home? How do we fairly compensate people for that? How do we look at some of the safety issues around working from home? both physical safety in terms of trips and falls and safe wiring and ergonomics, even things like domestic violence, elevated risk for women working from home. Another big issue is the misuse of digital monitoring and surveillance tactics by employers, and that's bad enough anywhere, but when it intrudes into your own living space, it's something that really has to be stopped. So I think this is a big area to look at in terms of labor regulation, collective bargaining, and others. A little bit about the impact of precarious work and how the pandemic was experienced. We all knew precarious work was a problem. Lots of great research done before the pandemic about how widespread it is and all of the different forms of insecure work. At least half of Canadian workers experience some dimension or more of precarious work as employers took advantage of their freedom, weak regulations, and the desperation of workers to make employment arrangements that were more or less like a just-in-time situation, where workers were hired and paid only when they were needed and then disposed of when they weren't, just like any other just-in-time productive input. Now we know how much precarious work has contributed to the spread of a contagion. We saw it in long-term care, for example, where staffing that was done on a precarious or agency type of basis, well, you had people who were holding multiple jobs. That's what always happens with precarious work. And if you hold multiple jobs, those people were literally, if they got infected, carrying the coronavirus from one long-term care facility to another. What a disaster. Same goes for the absence of sick pay and other normal benefits that most precarious workers or workers in precarious jobs experience. They didn't have anything to fall back on if they were exposed or thought they might be sick. Many of them felt the compulsion to keep working even when they should have been self-isolating. And so not just for fairness, but for safety and for the sustainability of getting back to work, we're going to have to address precarious work. They call it precarious work for a reason. It is precisely because workers in those jobs can be more easily disposed of. And if we look at what happened in the downturn months from February through April, who was it who was losing work? By and large, it was people in precarious positions. Overall employment fell about 15% during those 2 months. Again, that doesn't count all the hidden forms of unemployment that we mentioned. Very concentrated among people in insecure jobs. Workers in part-time jobs, twice as likely. People in temporary jobs, twice as likely. Like #DA, you don't need a PhD in economics to predict that people in temporary jobs are going to lose their work faster. Same goes for the private sector. Downturn in employment 4 times worse than in the public sector. This is an interesting one. If you didn't have a union, you were twice as likely to lose your job in that downturn than if you were in a union. And I've argued in a recent column in the Toronto Star, for example, that it's during tough times that people really come to appreciate the importance of having a union at their back and a few protections. It doesn't mean you're isolated from what's going on, but it does mean the employer has to go through a few more hoops before they can get rid of you. The last of those 10 10 things that have to change that I mentioned, in a way I think links them all together, which is workers have to have more power. They have to have a platform from which to express their demands, and they have to have leverage to win those demands. And if we don't address the power imbalance in our labor market, none of those problems, frankly, are going to get fixed. Even the most bread and butter health and safety changes that have to be made in workplaces around cleaning, sanitization, the spatial issue that I mentioned earlier, PPE, none of those totally obvious bread and butter health and safety changes will get made if workers don't have the power to demand that they get made, up to and including the right to stop work if and when those safety precautions are not in place. And we saw that big time with workplaces, whether it was taxi and rideshare drivers or meat packers or workers in isolated camps in agriculture or oil sands or anywhere else, places we knew would be outbreaks of contagion, but where the obvious protections were not taken by employers because they didn't have to. They weren't forced to, at least not until outbreaks occurred. This is also true at the macro level. Some of the big policy changes that are going to be required in the areas of income security, labor regulation, protections for precarious workers in precarious jobs. None of that will happen without workers having an organized voice and the power to make those demands. Even though I've joked about how depressing economics is as a subject these days, I actually still have a core of optimism in me about what this pandemic might mean and the doors that it could open. And if you look at history, there are times in which working people responded to terrible crises and came out of it stronger. It doesn't automatically happen, but it can happen. I think there's lots of opportunities in this moment for us to shift the goalposts of public common sense understanding about work, what jobs are valued, and the role of government in leading us back towards something that's better than what we had before. On the immediate short-term sense, we have to keep mobilizing all resources to trying to defeat coronavirus. And again, that's the precondition. The way to protect our economy is to protect the people who make up our economy. And that means doing everything we can to stop the coronavirus and completely rejecting this idea that it's an unacceptable economic cost for doing that. We have to prevent the outbreak of mass unemployment and depression-like conditions, and in the short run, provide income support for people who can't work. But income support alone isn't enough to rebuild an economy. We have to have a plan to put Canada back to work, and it's only government that has the authority and the resources to lead that plan. And that means a economy-wide, multi-sector vision for creating work in the public sector, in public services, in investment, in private industries, to take advantage of new technology, to take advantage of clean energy, and the other options we have to build a stronger, more diverse economy. And so long as there's unemployed people in Canada, there's no limit on what the government can spend in order to make that happen. The only limit there is the political power of old-fashioned, discredited ideas about debt walls and so on. I do see how public thinking about these issues has changed in many ways. Canadians are way more appreciative of the role of government in protecting them through this. There are very few people who believe that government should get smaller at this point in time. People have recognized the value produced by workers in essential roles, not just the healthcare workers that we applauded at 7 o'clock every night, but people doing checkout at grocery stores and delivering fast food and cleaning buildings and hospitals and schools. Millions of Canadians have experienced income security and the need for it. So the old idea that income security is only for lazy people who've got no work ethic, that idea is out the window, as are the traditional infatuation with balanced budgets and so on, out the window. So in that regard, I do conclude this Friday afternoon lecture on a somewhat more optimistic note. I believe that we can fight back and organize and win enough power to build back better than we went in.